It didn't sound like a historic announcement. It sounded like damage control. The quote itself was harmless. Routine, even. A coach talking about tone, defense, and a good bounce-back win. The kind of language that usually fades into the background before the clip even finishes playing. But while those words were coming out, something underneath them had already snapped. Because within hours, the basketball world wasn't reacting to the game at all. It was reacting to the move that no one saw coming, and the way it was delivered. After months of silence, tension, and one of the most polarizing roster decisions in recent sports memory, Team USA didn't just bring Caitlin Clark back into the fold. They didn't ease her in. They didn't test the waters. They handed her the captaincy. The same program that publicly told her to wait her turn. The same leadership that framed her absence as necessary for chemistry. The same system that insisted experience mattered more than impact. Now suddenly, she wasn't just included. She was in charge. On the surface, it looked like a victory. The kind of full-circle moment sports fans love to celebrate. Redemption. Validation. A young star finally getting the respect she deserved. But the more you looked at it, the less it felt like a celebration, and the more it felt like a concession. Because this wasn't announced with pride. There was no coordinated rollout. No glowing tribute video. No wave of veteran support flooding social media. Instead, it came out during a tense media availability. Flat delivery. No warmth. No visible enthusiasm. Just a statement dropped into the room and left there to hang. And that's what made people uncomfortable. If this was such an obvious decision, why did it feel so forced? If this was about leadership, why did it look like surrender? And if this was truly about basketball, why did it happen so suddenly? Cameras caught Caitlin in the background. Her posture was stiff. Her expression unreadable. Not the reaction of someone who had been campaigning for power, but of someone who had just been handed something heavy without warning. This didn't look like a promotion she asked for. It looked like a responsibility she couldn't refuse. That's the part most headlines skipped. Because when an institution that once shut you out suddenly puts a crown on your head, the story isn't about how far you've come. It's about what changed behind the scenes. Who lost leverage? Who felt pressure? And who decided this was the only move left, but not necessarily the best one. This moment wasn't the beginning of a new era. It was the result of a breaking point. And to understand why this decision happened, and why it may be far more dangerous than it looks, you have to go back to the moment when everything first started to fracture. To understand why this captaincy feels so unnatural, you have to rewind to the moment the trust between Caitlin Clark and the system first broke. When the Olympic roster was announced, the omission landed like a shockwave. Not because roster snubs are rare, but because this one violated the league's own logic. Caitlin Clark wasn't just another rising player at the time. She was the gravitational center of women's basketball. Ratings followed her. Arenas filled because of her. Entire broadcasts were built around whether she was playing that night. And yet, when the most visible stage in the sport revealed its lineup, her name wasn't there. The explanation came quickly. Too quickly. And it followed a script the sport had relied on for decades. She's young. She needs rest. She lacks international experience. Chemistry matters more than individual talent. On paper, those arguments sounded reasonable. That was the point. They were designed to sound airtight, even if they didn't fully add up. Because the underlying message wasn't really about Caitlin at all. It was about hierarchy. About reminding everyone, fans, media, and especially players, that no matter how big a star becomes, the program comes first. What made this different from past omissions was the reaction. Fans didn't shrug and move on. They didn't accept the explanation and trust the process. They pushed back. Hard. The conversation didn't stay contained to sports talk shows. It spilled into mainstream media, business coverage, and social platforms that had never paid attention to women's basketball before. Instead of fading, the outrage grew. And that reaction triggered something defensive inside the system. Rather than soften their stance, leadership doubled down. Coaches, former players, and long-standing voices within the sport circled the wagons. The message became sharper. Almost aggressive. Caitlyn didn't earn it yet. Veterans paid their dues. You don't disrupt a winning culture for popularity. Implicitly, the fans were told they didn't understand the game well enough to question the decision. Then came the gold medal. That victory became the shield. Proof, at least in the eyes of leadership, that they had been right all along. The podium moment mattered more than the process. They didn't just win, they felt validated. The system had held. The hierarchy had survived the challenge. But something subtle happened after that win, something far more important than the medal itself. The audience didn't come back the way they expected. Outside of Olympic moments, interest in the national program didn't surge. Casual viewers who had tuned in because of Caitlyn didn't suddenly attach themselves to the roster. The momentum didn't carry. The broader public conversation drifted right back to the player who wasn't there. And quietly, that created a problem no gold medal could solve. Because while the establishment believed the controversy was over, Caitlyn Clark's influence didn't shrink. It expanded. She entered the professional league and immediately proved that the attention wasn't hype. Ticket prices jumped. Broadcast numbers climbed. Road games felt like home games for her opponents because of how many people showed up just to watch her play. The snub didn't slow her down. It separated her from the system. And separation changes everything. What had once been a single roster decision started to feel like the opening shot in a longer conflict. Not a loud one. A cold one. No public feuds. No dramatic statements. Just distance. Careful language. And an unspoken understanding that Caitlyn Clark no longer fit neatly into the box the program was used to controlling. The Olympic decision wasn't just a missed opportunity. It was a declaration of authority. And for a while, leadership believed they had won. But authority only works when the people you're trying to control still need you. That assumption didn't hold for long. At some point, the conversation stopped being about jump shots, defensive schemes, or international experience. It just took a while for everyone to admit it. Because nothing about Caitlyn Clark's on-court profile changed in the months following the Olympic snub. She didn't suddenly transform into a different player. Her skill set was always obvious. Her range. Her vision. Her ability to bend a defense the moment she crossed half-court. If basketball reasons were truly the obstacle, time alone wouldn't have erased them. But something else did change. And it changed fast. The business side of the sport couldn't ignore the numbers anymore. Every building she walked into felt different. Attendance spikes weren't subtle. Merchandise didn't just sell, it vanished. Broadcasts that once struggled to hold casual viewers suddenly stayed competitive deep into games that would have been ignored in previous seasons. Caitlyn Clark didn't just draw interest. She reshaped behavior. That forced an uncomfortable realization. The league had spent years insisting that no individual mattered more than the system. That the brand came first. That fans would show up regardless of who was on the floor. Caitlyn's presence quietly dismantled that belief. Because when she wasn't playing, the drop-off was noticeable. And when she was, the entire ecosystem felt louder, faster, more urgent. This wasn't superstardom the sport was used to managing. This was leverage. And leverage changes how power works. Behind closed doors, the conversations shifted tone. It was no longer, does she fit what we're building? It became, what happens if she doesn't need us? Because for the first time, a women's basketball star wasn't just benefiting from the platform. She was expanding it beyond its original boundaries. And that expansion created a paradox. The professional league was booming, but the national program, outside of Olympic cycles, wasn't capturing that same energy. The gap became impossible to ignore. The entity that was supposed to represent the peak of the sport was no longer driving the conversation. It was reacting to it. That's when the pressure started creeping downward. Not from coaches. Not from players. From stakeholders who cared less about tradition and more about relevance. Broadcast partners noticed which games people actually watched. Sponsors noticed which jerseys people actually bought. And the math was brutal. When Caitlyn Clark was involved, attention followed. When she wasn't, it wandered. That reality made the original justification for keeping her at arm's length harder to defend. Chemistry doesn't pay for airtime. Seniority doesn't guarantee viewership. And experience, by itself, doesn't stop audiences from changing the channel. The argument wasn't that Caitlyn was better than everyone else. It was that she moved the needle in ways no one else could. And once that becomes clear, basketball logic stops being the deciding factor. This is the moment where institutions usually hesitate, where they try to preserve the old order while quietly benefiting from the new one. But hesitation only works when the leverage gap is small. In this case, it wasn't. Caitlyn didn't need to say anything. She didn't issue ultimatums. She didn't lobby publicly for more influence. Her presence alone did the talking. And every sellout crowd, every rating spike, every viral clip added another data point that couldn't be ignored. The system wasn't losing control because she demanded it. It was losing control because the audience chose her. That's when the conversation stopped being about basketball and started becoming about survival. This is where the story stops being public and starts getting uncomfortable. Because when institutions change direction this fast, it's rarely because they suddenly had a change of heart. It's because someone with leverage made it clear that the old plan was no longer acceptable. And according to people familiar with how these decisions actually get made, that pressure didn't come from the locker room. It came from above it. The rumor circulating inside media circles is simple and brutal. The captaincy wasn't a coaching decision. It was a mandate. A quiet one. The kind that never shows up in official statements but reshapes everything anyway. Broadcast partners had been tracking viewership trends for months. Not just headline numbers, but minute-by-minute engagement. Where viewers tuned in. Where they dropped off. What clips traveled beyond the core fanbase. And the pattern was impossible to miss. Games without Caitlyn Clark struggled to hold casual viewers. Games with her pulled people who didn't even consider themselves basketball fans. That distinction matters. Casual viewers are the currency. They're the ones sponsors care about. They're the ones who justify primetime slots, bigger ad buys, and long-term commitments. Hardcore fans will watch almost anything. Casual fans will not. And the national program had a problem. Outside of the Olympics, interest plateaued. The same names rotated through coverage. The same storylines repeated. Nothing broke through to new audiences. Meanwhile, Caitlyn's professional games were doing exactly that. Breaking through. That's where the alleged ultimatum enters the picture. According to insiders, meetings took place that had nothing to do with basketball strategy. They were about projections. Market growth. Long-term visibility. One message kept coming up over and over. If Caitlyn Clark isn't centered, the audience won't be either. This wasn't framed as a threat. It didn't need to be. The numbers spoke loudly enough. Networks don't like uncertainty. Sponsors don't like stagnation. And both groups had already seen what happens when Caitlyn is sidelined. So the pressure moved downward. Not in public. Not with confrontation. But with expectations. Subtle ones. The kind that make it clear which outcomes are acceptable and which ones aren't. Suddenly, keeping Caitlyn on the periphery wasn't a neutral choice anymore. It was a risk. That explains the speed. There was no gradual reintegration. No soft launch. No testing phase. Because incremental change wouldn't satisfy the people watching from the top. They didn't want symbolic inclusion. They wanted gravity. They wanted certainty. They wanted a signal big enough to tell the audience, unmistakably, that this program now revolved around the player they were tuning in for. Captaincy does that instantly. It reframes everything without saying a word. It tells broadcasters who to focus on. It tells sponsors whose image matters. It tells casual viewers exactly where to look. And it does all of that while allowing leadership to claim it was about trust, growth, and leadership development. But the delivery gave it away. The stiffness. The lack of enthusiasm. The absence of celebration. Those aren't the signs of a coach proudly promoting a player. They're the signs of someone executing a decision they didn't originate. Someone aware that resistance is no longer an option. In that context, the The captaincy stops looking like empowerment and starts looking like consolidation. A move designed to lock Caitlin into the structure rather than let her orbit outside of it. They didn't just want her presence. They wanted her tied to the program's fate. Because once she's the leader, the story changes. If things go well, the system adapts and takes credit for evolving. If things go badly, responsibility shifts downward. And that brings us to the part of the story no one wanted public. What happened just before the announcement was made? According to multiple leaks, the decision wasn't finalized weeks in advance. It wasn't the result of long-term planning. It happened fast, within a narrow window that caught even people inside the program off guard. The most persistent rumor centers on a private meeting that took place less than 24 hours before the public announcement. This wasn't a team discussion. It wasn't a leadership council. And it definitely wasn't ceremonial. Caitlin Clark was reportedly called into a closed office at the training facility, away from teammates, away from staff, and away from cameras. When she got the message to report, she didn't assume it was good news. People close to her say her first thought wasn't promotion, it was punishment. Another lecture. Another reminder to stay quiet. Another explanation about timing and patience. That's what made what followed so jarring. The tone of the meeting, according to those familiar with the conversation, wasn't authoritative. It was uneasy, almost pleading. This wasn't a coach laying out expectations. It was a program confronting its own vulnerability. For the first time, the imbalance was acknowledged out loud. The gap between the US and the rest of the world is shrinking. International teams are faster, more disciplined, less reliant on individual dominance. The old formula, overwhelm with talent and depth, doesn't intimidate the way it used to. And the veterans who carried that formula are aging out at the same time the sport itself is changing. That context matters. Because what Caitlin was allegedly told wasn't just, "We want you to lead." It was, "We need you to stabilize this." Not just on the court. Off it. Her presence keeps attention high. Her name keeps cameras on. Her influence buys time. Time for transition. Time for restructuring. Time to cover the cracks that are starting to show beneath the surface of a program that has been dominant for so long it forgot what vulnerability feels like. In that light, the captaincy stops being an honor and starts looking like a tool. A shield. If scrutiny rises, Caitlin absorbs it. If performance dips, questions go to her leadership. If the locker room fractures, she becomes the headline. The promotion reframes responsibility without changing power at the top. People who know Caitlin describe her reaction as restrained. She didn't celebrate. She didn't negotiate. She listened. She understood exactly what was being asked without needing it spelled out. And that's why she didn't rush to accept it emotionally, even if she accepted it formally. Because there's a difference between being chosen and being needed. One is flattering. The other is dangerous. By the time the meeting ended, the decision was already locked in. Not because Caitlin pushed for it, but because the system couldn't afford for her to say no. You don't turn down your country. You don't publicly reject a role framed as leadership. The optics alone make refusal impossible. So she walked out carrying something heavier than a title. And the ripple effects started immediately, especially in the one place this decision was guaranteed to land hardest. The locker room. If the announcement felt cold to the public, it landed even colder inside the locker room. This wasn't a group that needed to be told how leadership worked. The hierarchy had been understood for years without ever being written down. Seniority mattered. Olympic cycles mattered. Time served mattered. Captains weren't chosen because they were popular or marketable. They were chosen because they had endured the grind, the travel, the politics, and the expectations of the program over multiple generations. That's what made this move feel like an earthquake. Veterans didn't find out through a team meeting. They didn't get a chance to weigh in privately or prepare for the optics. Many of them learned the same way the public did, through media alerts and press clips. And when something that significant happens without internal alignment, the silence afterward becomes meaningful. There were no congratulatory posts. No public endorsements. No earned it messages from senior players. Just nothing. In modern sports, silence isn't neutral. It's a statement. Behind that silence sits something deeper than jealousy. This isn't about one player getting attention. It's about a system that promised one path to leadership and suddenly rewrote the rules without warning. For veterans who had shaped their careers around loyalty to the program, the captaincy represented something sacred. It was the final acknowledgement that years of sacrifice had meant something. Now that symbol was being repurposed. And that's where resentment starts to harden. Reports suggest the locker room split almost immediately, not into shouting matches or open rebellion, but into distance. Younger players, many of whom grew up watching Caitlin and benefited from the new attention she brought to the sport, saw the move as inevitable. Progress. A reflection of reality. The future arriving faster than expected. The veterans saw something else entirely. They saw the erosion of culture. They saw marketing overpowering merit. They saw a line crossed that can't easily be redrawn. Some felt sidelined without ever being benched. Others reportedly questioned whether this was still the environment they wanted to finish their careers in. When players who have already won everything start thinking about walking away early, that's not ego talking. That's disillusionment. And it creates a dangerous dynamic for the person standing in the middle of it. Because Caitlin didn't take anything from them directly. She didn't campaign for their role. She didn't publicly question their leadership. But she became the face of the change they never agreed to. Which means frustration that can't be directed upward starts drifting sideways. Leadership in that environment is a minefield. Every decision gets second-guessed. Every huddle becomes a test. Every moment of authority risks being interpreted as entitlement. And that's before a single pass is made in practice. What makes this fracture especially volatile is that it isn't about basketball disagreements. It's about identity. About who this program belongs to now. And when identity fractures, performance usually follows. Which puts Caitlin in the most precarious position possible. Not just leading a team, but leading one that may not fully want to be led by her. That's where the risk becomes personal. And it's why some analysts believe this promotion wasn't just risky, it followed a pattern that has burned stars before. There's a term used in corporate psychology for moments like this. It's called the glass cliff. It describes a pattern where leadership roles are offered at the exact moment failure becomes most likely. On the surface, it looks like opportunity. In reality, it's exposure. The system promotes someone during instability, then steps back and lets them absorb the consequences if things go wrong. The parallels here are hard to ignore. The international gap is closing. Other countries are faster, more cohesive, and less dependent on individual brilliance. The U.S. roster is transitioning at the same time expectations remain unchanged. Dominance is still assumed, even as margins shrink. That combination creates risk. And risk always needs a buffer. By elevating Caitlin now, responsibility shifts without fully shifting control. If the team struggles, the narrative is already preloaded. Leadership didn't fail, the experiment did. The culture didn't fracture, the captain couldn't unify it. The system can point upward and say it listened to fans, adapted to pressure, and gave the new era a chance. That's the asymmetry. If Caitlin succeeds, the program claims evolution. If she struggles, she becomes the explanation. The timing matters just as much as the title. This isn't a stable moment where leadership can grow naturally. It's a period of scrutiny, transition, and heightened expectations. Every exhibition game becomes a referendum. Every international matchup turns into proof or indictment. And that pressure isn't shared evenly. Veterans with established legacies can afford to disengage emotionally. Coaches can adjust narratives. Administrators can wait out a news cycle. The captain can't. Her performance becomes symbolic whether she wants it to or not. Wins validate the decision. Losses question her readiness. That's what makes this situation so dangerous. It asks one person to represent stability while standing on unstable ground. It places accountability at the center of chaos and calls it leadership. And it does so while pretending this is empowerment rather than insulation. Caitlin understands that. People around her say she's acutely aware of how quickly praise flips to blame. She's navigated expectations her entire career, but this is different. This isn't about proving she belongs. It's about carrying the consequences of a system recalibrating under pressure. And once you see it through that lens, the captaincy stops feeling like validation and starts feeling like exposure. Because glass cliffs don't shatter immediately. They crack slowly, under weight. And everyone watches to see who falls. The reaction online didn't move in one direction. It split. Hard. On one side were the millions of newer fans who arrived with Caitlin Clark and never pretended otherwise. To them, this moment felt overdue. Justice. Finally delivered. Proof that resistance only delayed the inevitable. They flooded timelines with edits, stats, and side-by-side clips. The message was simple. Talent and impact won. The system bent because it had to. For this group, the captaincy wasn't risky, it was corrective. A long-awaited alignment between reality and authority. They didn't see politics. They saw momentum. And they weren't interested in patience anymore. But across the comment sections, another reaction was forming just as fast. Longtime fans, former players, and purists pushed back. Not quietly. Not gently. They argued that something fundamental had been compromised. That leadership in a national program isn't supposed to be reactive. That it's earned through years of shared sacrifice, not audience demand. To them, this wasn't evolution. It was erosion. The tone turned personal. Accusations flew in every direction. The coach was weak. The veterans were bitter. Caitlin was a marketing plant. The program was selling out. And once those lines were drawn, there was no middle ground left to stand on. What's striking is how predictable this fracture was. Because controversy wasn't an unintended consequence of the decision. It was fuel. Debate drives engagement. Conflict sustains attention. And in a landscape where relevance is measured in clicks, outrage performs just as well as celebration. That's the uncomfortable truth. The system didn't need universal approval. It needed conversation. It needed volume. It needed people arguing about Team USA again instead of scrolling past it. And in that sense, the decision worked perfectly. Every disagreement amplified the spotlight. Every viral argument extended the lifespan of the story. The irony is that both sides believe they're defending the sport. One side sees growth and visibility as survival. The other sees tradition and process as integrity. Neither is entirely wrong. But neither can coexist comfortably once the hierarchy shifts. And standing in the center of that collision is Caitlin. Not as an instigator, but as the symbol everything is being projected onto. Praise and blame, hope and resentment, progress and loss. All of it collapses onto her role. Which means this captaincy isn't just about leading a team. It's about carrying a cultural argument that existed long before she arrived. And that's why what happens next won't just define a season. It will define how power works in women's basketball going forward. This decision wasn't made in a vacuum, and it won't end quietly. Naming Caitlin Clark captain didn't resolve tension inside the program, it concentrated it. It pulled years of unresolved conflict, shifting incentives, and competing visions of the sport into a single point. And now that point has a name, a face, and a title attached to it. For the establishment, this was a gamble born out of necessity. They didn't suddenly abandon their beliefs about hierarchy or patience. They adjusted because the environment forced them to. Attention had moved. Leverage had shifted. And ignoring that shift became more dangerous than embracing it. For the veterans, this moment feels like an erasure. Not of their accomplishments, but of the rules they were told mattered. Rules they followed. Rules they defended. Watching those rules bend overnight sends a message that loyalty isn't the currency it used to be. For Caitlin, this isn't a coronation. It's exposure. She steps into leadership at a moment when stability is already cracking. When expectations remain sky high but margins are shrinking. When every success will be credited to adaptation and every failure will be pinned on disruption. That's not empowerment. That's accountability without insulation. And yet, this moment was inevitable. Because the sport has changed. The audience has changed. The economics have changed. And once those forces move, institutions can either lead the transition or get dragged through it. Team USA chose the latter, even if it won't admit it publicly. What happens next will tell us everything. If this works, the old guard will quietly rewrite history and say evolution was always the plan. If it doesn't, they'll point to this moment as proof that hierarchy exists for a reason. Either way, Caitlyn becomes the reference point. The experiment. The explanation. That's the cost of being bigger than the system that built you. And whether this ends in a golden era or a public implosion, one thing is already clear. The balance of power in women's basketball has shifted permanently. Titles didn't cause it. Decisions didn't cause it. The audience did. Now, if you made it this far, you're not a casual viewer, and that matters. Channels like this survive on informed viewers who care about the deeper layers of the game. The power dynamics, the business pressures, and the stories happening behind the press conferences. If you want more breakdowns like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. If this video helped you see the situation differently, like it tells the algorithm this conversation is worth spreading. And most importantly, leave a comment. Do you think this captaincy is the start of something great, or the beginning of a fracture that can't be repaired? Your engagement directly shapes what stories get told next, and in a sport where power is shifting, that influence matters more than ever.